Okay, how's it everyone? Welcome to week 5. So I'll be taking all the lectures this week. Ian is away. I think he's doing the Cape Town Cycle Challenge. He's a cyclist. So yeah, today we're going to be looking at something a bit different. Later on in the week on Wednesday, we're going to be looking at your essay assignment in a bit more detail, and then we'll do a bit of a workshop in the tutorial on it as well. But we're now moving away from grand theories about SLA. I mean, moving more towards theories about more specific things that impact it. So what's often called individual differences. And obviously people are different. There are lots of similarities across different people, but sometimes it's the individual differences that matter. So we're starting to get into that, and we're getting into personally my favorite topic, which is motivation within second language learning. Okay. I'll just wait until we have some silence. Okay, we ready to start? All the people who are chatting, are you ready to listen? Okay. So I've set the readings. You can find the readings on Are You Connected? And the first reading is much simpler than last week's. It's from Hummel, Kirsten Hummel, who you've read 2 readings from her textbook on SLA before. And individual differences. And these are the 5 different kind of headings that she comes up with. Today, we're going to be focusing in on motivation and a little to do with attitude, but more focused just on motivation. So the reading will go over all 5 of these, but it's very much an overview kind of reading. It's not in the weeds, it's not in depth. Okay, so you don't need to take notes on that. That's just trying to situate what we're doing. So in broad strokes, individual differences, this is one of the ways that you could kind of divide up the types of individual differences that you find. And I'll just say, because I'll be doing these lectures in the context also of social factors in second language. And you could kind of say that social factors are also individual differences, but obviously if it's a social factor, there's something about society, which is usually there'd be something general. It's not specific to an individual, but at the same time, if you take 5 individuals, they have different social factors that are affecting them. So it's also, whatever is social is also individual at the same time. But anyway, we're not looking at social factors explicitly now. Obviously, motivation is impacted by society and social factors, but we're looking more at the dynamics of motivation itself. We'll get to social factors later in the week on Wednesday, potentially next week as well. Okay, so focusing on the ID or individual difference of motivation today. So today's lecture, we're going to cover pretty much 4 things. The majority of the time will be spent on the bottom 3. And then I'm going to just give you a brief overview of kind of one of the OG original theories of motivation in second language learning, second language acquisition, which is Gardner. It's also Lambert as well, but Gardner's socio-educational model of SLA. And that really does focus on, I guess, motivation as well as attitudes and how that'll interact with learning. But we're not into that. We're going to be looking at L2 motivational self-system, which is, at least until recently, I haven't checked the most recent scholarship on this, but has been the most popular theory for understanding motivation in second language acquisition. And it builds on possible self-theory and self-determination theory. That's kind of its intellectual heritage, shall we say. Okay, so before we get there though, why is it relevant? Why is this individual difference a relevant thing? And I'm going to just go through a quote from a Hungarian scholar called Zoltán Dornier, who came up with the L2 motivation self-system. It's quite a mouthful. And this is what he has to say. So it provides the primary impetus to initiate L2 learning and later the driving force to sustain the long, often tedious learning process. All other factors involved in SLA presuppose motivation. So motivation is kind of that helps initiate the entire process. It's one of the necessary conditions for engaging in language learning behavior at all. And if you don't have, even individuals with remarkable abilities cannot accomplish long-term goals. And it doesn't really matter whether you have good curricula or good teaching. They won't necessarily achieve, like, I guess, the ideal outcome of second language learning and acquisition, which is fluency or high proficiency. So there needs to be sufficient motivation. And then high motivation, if you're extremely motivated, it can make up for a whole bunch of negative factors which might affect SLA. So maybe you don't have conditions are super bad. High motivation can overcome those things. Okay, so that's from Dornier and Ryan. They have a great book. For those of you who are more interested, probably, I guess, at honors and master's level, it's called The Psychology of Language Learning. It's from 2015, so obviously it's 10 years old now, but it's the 2nd edition. So there was a lot of kind of stuff from when they first published it in 2005, I think it was, to 2015. And it's a great text on learning more about specifically individual differences. And the chapter on motivation is great. Okay, so what role does it play? One of the things similar to that quote that I was reading, it's a key predictor of success in language learning if you're highly motivated. I mean, this kind of is commonsensical. It makes sense, right? It also determines the effort, the persistence, and the engagement. So, I mean, you can have people in a classroom like this who are completely disengaged with what I'm saying. It depends on whether they're sufficiently motivated to actually listen to me, engage with it, process it, think about it. So, yeah, motivation is kind of a crucial factor for all these other things that are crucial for learning: effort, persistence, engagement. And yeah, there's multiple factors. Like I was saying, there's social factors that impact motivation. Environmental ones, for instance, your motivation might be severely impacted if there's a noise outside that makes you unable to kind of hear things, and it's chaotic. And then I guess the main ones that we'd be looking at are psychological in nature now. And a lot of what we're going to be doing today is really psychology as applied to second language acquisition. And there's always been an interplay between psychology and linguistics, because obviously language happens within minds, within the psyche. So SLA is kind of like an interdisciplinary part of the time. And that's why we're delving into psychology today. Okay, so the subfield of L2 motivation, which you can kind of see as one part of SLA as an overall field of study, is called L2 motivation. And really the pioneers were Gardner, and he had what was called a socio-educational model of motivation and learning more generally. And look, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there were two main concepts that came out of it, which then impacted the study and the theorizing on motivation afterwards. And it would be bad to just reduce everything that is in the socio-educational model down to these two orientations. So there's the integrativeness or the integrative orientation, and then there's the instrumental orientation. And so these kind of two concepts are extremely popular when you would talk about Gardner's socio-educational model. There's a lot more to it than this, but these are two crucial concepts that ever since anyone else who's been working on motivation has had to kind of grapple with to relate their own theorizing back to these concepts. So, I mean, they're pretty well named. One is a desire to integrate with the target language community, and that's kind of one of the orientations that then give you motivation. Or there's just the language becomes an instrument, a tool in order to do something else, right? For career, education, those of you who are compelled to take linguistics will understand how you need to sometimes do something that you don't enjoy for the instrumental benefits of that. Okay, so another thing that he did, and he related then motivation and attitudes. And he came up kind of with a model of how attitudes impact motivation. And in the next slide, we'll have a look at it. Again, not going to delve deeply into this, but I just want to give you some of the kind of the heritage of motivation over time, some of the historical theorizing that's gone on. Final thing I'll say is that he developed an instrument to measure motivation and attitudes for learners. And right at the end of this lecture, I'll show you an instrument that I produced for my master's thesis in order to measure attitudes and motivation. And so you'll get a bit of a sense. And I drew quite a bit also from the way that he developed his own tool to measure that. So it would be another way of saying what a battery is. It's a strange, I don't know why they call it a battery. But it's effectively a questionnaire. The attitude motivation test battery is just a kind of questionnaire. All right, so this is a model, and you can just kind of cast your eyes over this. You can see integrative orientation is in the top left. That impacts the construct of integrativeness, just pretty difficult to define. Another thing that feeds into that is interest in foreign language, and then attitudes towards the second language community, so the target language community. All of those things go into whether the integrativeness is strong or not. And then he thinks that whatever integrativeness is impacts motivation. Then there's also attitudes towards the process of learning. So your evaluation of how teachers are, whether a teacher is good or not, engaging or not, your evaluation of the course, whether it's got interesting topics, all of those things then contribute towards your attitudes towards learning, which impact motivation. So you can kind of see how he's building up that there's all these components that all impact and eventually make their way towards motivation. Okay, I won't look at the others on the side here, but just to give you a sense of how he was doing his theorizing. Okay, so moving then on from that, I'm going to be focusing in this lecture on Zoltán Dornye's, so yeah, rough name, he's Hungarian, He died quite recently, unfortunately. And he was kind of a giant within the motivation subsection of SLA. And there's elements of the model which kind of built on Gardner, but he drew a lot of things from more recent psychology. Gardner also came out of the psychological field, social psychology specifically. But in Dornier's case, so the L2MSS, I don't know if I should use the acronym or the full title, it's super long. That came out of possible self or self-discrepancy theory. You can kind of view it as both, or self-determination theory. And both of these are not specifically related to second language acquisition or learning, but they are applied to it in Dornier's system of the L2 motivational self system. Okay. So starting with, so we're going to be starting then with possible selves by Marcus and Nurius and Higgins, those scholars who spent a lot of time looking at this. So the idea is that there are three main types of a possible self, right? And this is like, I was super engaged by this when I first discovered it because it's so applicable to everything in your life. So there's the ideal selves that we would very much like to become. So the successful self, the creative self, the admired self. Then there's the selves that we are afraid of becoming, the alone, employed self. You can add on whatever kind of selves you want to add in there. And then the third one is the ones that we could become. It's almost the ones that just by default, likely we're going to become, there's almost expectations that's who we're going to be. And it's just really often more shaped by circumstances as opposed to you shaping circumstances so that you can become your ideal self. That would be the first category. Those are kind of the three, their typology or three types of possible selves is divided up into these three categories. And I mean, you can see it as representing best case, worst case, and probable scenario for who you are likely to become. And then obviously, I mean, it would make sense that if these are kind of the selves, the possible selves in the future, in some way this would influence motivation and goal setting. And as we continue, we'll see how Dornier then uses this theory to speak specifically about second language motivation. So then Higgins, who also was kind of talking about similar things, he just used slightly different language. He identified two selves, the ideal self, so who with attributes that you'd like to possess, so your hopes, aspirations, your wishes, and then your ought self, who you ought to become. So this is like your duties, your obligations, your responsibilities. Things typically that are external to you, they don't like come from within your own intrinsic desire for things, but you feel almost expectations around you saying that this is who you ought to be. So it doesn't necessarily align with your own desires or wishes. And so Marcus and Nurius in the previous slide, they also mentioned these concepts. They were aware of Higgins's work on this, but they didn't really like integrate it into their own three types of, we just go back there, the ideal selves, the selves we're afraid of, and then the selves that we are likely or probably going to become. Okay. So, and expanding from that then, so Higgins then, you could talk about Higgins' work as being self-discrepancy theory. He has the idea that, okay, you've got an ideal self and you've got an ought self. And the discrepancy between the ought self and the ideal self and who you currently are, the discrepancy, as in like the distance from who you are to those things is one of the things that motivates you. And he uses the idea of self-guides. So this ideal self and this ought self are guides that kind of point the direction of where you need to go in your life. And that's where motivation arises from. So it's the desire to reduce the discrepancy between the actual self and the ideal or ought selves. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of Higgins's theory here. So they provide incentive, direction, impetus for action, And when there's a significant discrepancy, so like it's major, it can trigger self-regulatory strategies to reduce the gap. So you would in effect regulate your current self so that you can become one of those two selves, the ideal or the ought. So moving now on to, okay, so that's some of the initial kind of theory that influenced Dornier. The next is by Deci and Ryan, and this is different. This is now talking, this is I guess, a model or theory of how motivation works that's not specific to language learning. So this is more specific to just motivation, as opposed to the self-concept and I guess the psyche, which is what we previously were looking at. And they have pretty much two main kinds of motivation. There's intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And I mean, you can kind of read those points there. It's pretty straightforward. Intrinsic comes from within, extrinsic from without. And then the thing, so yeah, I'll like 2 points. The second point under each heading, the most autonomous and self-determined form of motivation would be intrinsic. That's the thing. You don't really need to have strong, like, it doesn't need to be strong if it's intrinsic because it's coming from within. It's something that you desire, that you actually want to do, right? Whereas extrinsic motivation, it's not necessarily the case that you would want to do it. So it might be quite weak, but at the same time, it can be internalized. So the expectations from outside can be internalized and you can maybe integrate it into your own ideal self, for instance. And yes?
But then how do you then determine that it's coming from without when you internalize it?
I think it's really difficult to know whether it's coming from without. You'd probably have to do psychoanalysis for that. And there is some elements of this come from the more psychoanalytic strain of psychology. But there are stages of internalization, right? And so they try to kind of map out, well, how can you internalize extrinsic motivation so that it becomes more internal and more intrinsic? Okay, so there's external, and they use the terminology. This is where it gets a bit complex because now it's obviously extrinsic motivation, but then in order for extrinsic motivation to become internalized, they've got 4 different forms of regulation, the way that you would regulate that external motivation. The first is external regulation, which is the least self-determined. So you can see it's going back to the name of the theory, self-determination theory. It's not self-determined, it's coming purely external rewards or threats, praise, punishment. So in the absence of this kind of external regulation, might be a teacher, might be a parent, might be a peer group who are very influential in your life. If they were to disappear, there would be no kind of internalization of the things that they are motivating you to do. And that's closely linked back to Higgins's idea of the ought self. So you could kind of see an overlap between these two concepts. External regulation is aligned with whatever your ought self is. Then to use another term, introjected regulation, which is the next stage, is when you have external rules that are out there, and this would be maybe moral or ethical rules that you then internalize to avoid feeling guilty or anxiety. So for instance, there's laws in South Africa or worldwide, there's norms in society for how you should treat people, respecting elders, whatever, how it works. And those are things then that can kind of be introjected, which just really means kind of injected into kind of yourself, and it becomes something that almost regulates yourself and your motivational systems. But that's more at the level of almost the effective side of things, to avoiding guilt or anxiety, and that's why it becomes more part of you, becomes a bit more intrinsic, right? But it's still associated with the self that you ought to be. But it's more so than purely external regulation. Again, it's difficult maybe to figure out where the boundaries are between these different forms of regulation, but you'll see that there are stages here. So then the third form of regulation is identified regulation, which is where you start identifying with certain values or the value of a certain activity, because it's like you're starting to recognize that this is something that's useful for you. So initially, maybe when you're a young child and you're forced to do something, it would be purely externally regulated. But then as you start to realize the value of that thing, maybe when you're older, it'd be like, oh, okay, this actually can be useful for furthering my own goals in life. So I'm going to start doing these things. And they start shifting towards your ideal self and who your ideal self is. So if language learning was something that you were forced to do, it was purely external, gradually then you can internalize it so that it starts shifting into whoever your ideal self is. And the final one is integrated regulation, where it's the most self-determined or integrated, or to use the terminology here, the most internalized. Irritates me that they use so many terms. They could have probably kept it just to one synonym, but it's where it's fully aligned with who you want to be, right? So it came from the outside originally, but it's been completely internalized, and that's closest to whoever the ideal self is, right? Okay, so moving then on to Dornier's L2 motivational self system, he draws on so the self-determination theory, the self-discrepancy theory, which is related then to the other one, which, if I just go back to it, is the possible self theory. And so the ideal L2 self is your personal vision of being a proficient L2 user. So you, in effect, can imagine yourself in the future, maybe, of being a proficient user of German or Mandarin Chinese or French or whatever it might be. And if that aligns with your ideal self, as Higgins put it, and obviously Dornier is now borrowing from Higgins, that can then be kind of a motivation, a way of encapsulating the motivation to reduce the discrepancy between who you are right now, unable to speak that second language, and who you want to become in the future. Not all learners will have an ideal L2 self. They might just have an ought to L2 self, which is then the second component of his system. And that's really where you learning a second language has everything to do with the expectations that you feel from without. External pressures, maybe it's your family members, maybe you are in a place where everyone just expects you to learn a language and you don't really feel like you have a choice in the matter. So pretty much, I mean, you can kind of see how it's derived from those theories that we were looking at previously. And this doesn't necessarily, well, we'll get to it now, it doesn't necessarily actually, it's not particularly strong a lot of the time. And often it needs to be compulsory for that self, as it were, to be a motivating factor. And then the final part of his system, he obviously thinks that there are these two selves that are relevant, but then another one is also the language learning experience. And so this also impacts motivation. So he's kind of, I mean, we saw Gardner's very elaborate model, which has all these various elements, including attitude, the idea of integrativeness, which then impacts motivation. And so there's lots of components to his model. Dornier's is simpler. He's saying that there's these two selves. Some might be stronger, some might be present, some might not be present at all. So you might have no ought to self. You might feel as if there's absolutely no reason that I would need to learn French. Right? No one in my family is prompting me to do that. That would be purely a function or a part of my ideal L2 self, because I just love the sound of the language. I love the literature and the media that comes out of the French-speaking world, whatever it might be. And then the language learning experience, obviously. So this is getting to maybe your attitudes about your teachers or the environment where you are learning. And those things can positively or negatively influence yourself, the ideal self or the ought to self. So diving a bit deeper into the second language, the ideal second language self, using then Higgins's language, and Dornier borrows from this, it acts as a motivational self-guide. So in effect, whatever you can envision of yourself in the future being able to speak this language super proficiently, whether you have thought about it consciously or unconsciously. Indeed, some people can daydream, they can imagine themselves in the future being able to proficiently speak a language. That's almost a marker that you have a very vivid, like, ideal L2 self, if you can imagine it vividly, right? And that vivid kind of thing in your imagination and a sense of like, I can achieve this, this can be something that I can realize in my life, gives you some kind of motivational impetus to achieve that and to make it real in your own life. So it's strongly linked to visualization, imagination. And this is something that then comes out, I mean, subsequent to Dornier coming up with this. He initially came up with it in 2005. And ever since then, there's been an explosion of research of people testing out this L2MSS with its three main kind of components that it looks at, and seeing how well it actually can predict, for instance, persistence in language learning. And obviously the amount at the beginning when we looked at why motivation is important, one of the things that motivation provides is like the amount of motivation will determine the amount of effort and engagement and all these kinds of things, right? So as a result of that, if you can measure motivation in some way, you can then relate to things like, well, how long do people persist in learning? Like, do they give up or not? Okay. And it has been shown consistently that the ideal second language self can predict long-term commitment to second language learning. So if a person has this, right, and they can visualize themselves in the future, and you can kind of measure that, and we'll get to that right at the end of the lecture, then that can help predict it. And there's also a question then, it might be the next, I'll come to the last point now, but are there techniques then that you can stimulate an ideal L2 self in a learner, right? And this is some of the subsequent work that they've looked at, given that it does predict commitment to language learning, which particularly for people in school and university, sure, they might get a lot of the grammar, they might get a lot of the foundation of the language, but it requires them to go out and actually practice and use it in the real world, where they don't have all the scaffolding of teachers and peers. So if they can develop an ideal second language self and really start to practice visualizing, then maybe that would be a way that they can ensure beyond formal structured learning that they would continue to reach a point of proficiency. And so there has been research and pedagogical and kind of methodological interventions trying to help learners to stimulate a vivid, ideal second language self. And going back to Gardner's theory, he spoke about the integrative orientation, the target language culture or people group. Often the ideal second language self correlates. There's a link when they would test for integrativeness. They often will also find that it correlates directly with both intrinsic motivation, which you can test in other ways, and intrinsic motivation then also correlates with the ideal second language self. So all of these constructs of motivation with each other. When you find one, you typically find the others. It has everything to do with the social expectations and pressures that make you feel as if you need to learn a second language. Represents the societal external influences. Also, extrinsic motivations align typically with the auto L2 self. So job requirements, parental expectations, peer expectations. Also potentially, significant other expectations if you on a relationship with someone who speaks a completely different language and they feel very strongly that, for instance, if you were to get married or have children with them, that we'd need to preserve my heritage, right? So that could be another external expectation. There's all sorts. It also acts as a self-guide, so it kind of guides you in the future, but it's not correlated with persistence in second language learning, and which is interesting. Part of that is because it probably hasn't been internalized a lot of the time into the ideal L2 self, which is very intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic. So it doesn't correlate with persistence. However, some people who have a very strong L2 self or second language self do persist. So it's not to say that people don't persist if only the ought to L2 self is strong. It depends on the strength of the social pressure and the perceived necessity of achieving that self in the future, right? And so in the absence of an ideal L2 self, if you just have a strong second language self, you may go through the motions of learning, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're engaged to the extent that you should. So if it's compulsory, maybe you might go through the motions of the behavior of learning, doesn't mean you'll engage. But if it's a voluntary thing and there's actually it's not compulsory for like job requirements or for a course requirement, you might just give up after you do the first year or the first 6 months of the course. So if it's external, I'm sure you all recognize, if you're forced to do something that you don't want to do, as soon as you don't have those forced kind of requirements on you, it's almost like a burden that you can just throw off and carry on and do the things that you actually want to do in life, right? So you can see how the ought to self is not necessarily the best predictor for persistence in language learning, but doesn't mean that it predicts failure or giving up. It's neither here nor there. So then the third factor, looking at the second language learning experience, if it's highly compelling. So some of you may have had this experience. You come to a course, either at school or now here at university, and you thought it was going to be terrible and you were super uninterested, but it turns out that either the teacher or the group of peers that you found who were with you in tutorials were just great, and they asked questions that really piqued your interest and intrigued you, and it started to grow on you, right? So the learning experience can actually be a significant factor in motivation, and that's why Dornier included it, not just the two selves, but then also the learning experience. So there's the interactions with mediators of the second language, both in formal and informal learning situations. So first language or native speakers, your teachers. Those interactions, that experience of those interactions can be super positive or maybe negative or just meh, so. Obviously, there's media in the second language, and that's also part of the experience of learning, right? So if there are books, if there are textbooks, if there are videos, if there's music, some of these things can be super engaging. Some of them can just not engage you at all. So some of the crucial factors then in the learning experience would be the extent to which there's teacher scaffolding or support, especially if you're learning it formally in an institution like this, as opposed to learning it informally through whatever means. I guess whether the curriculum has been designed well, whether it's engaging, whether it works, the methodology of teaching, whether you're using a very kind of comprehensible input focus where there's lots of engaging, interesting material, or if it's very interaction focused, which may be also interesting, or if it's just like grammar rules and that's it. And you just have to kind of repeat all the grammar. Obviously, peer interactions. So all of these experience would then, positive experiences will reinforce your motivational self-guides. Negative experiences will weaken them. So I'll come to that now. So if you can just see, we've got the ideal L2 self, second language self, the ought to second language self, and then the learning experience. And all of these things contribute in Dornier's system or model to motivation, right? Both the kind of motivation as well as the intensity of motivation. And then obviously motivation then relates to things like persistence in language learning. So if we were to then, I obviously presented Gardner's socio-educational model, and to relate it to Dornier, the ideal L2 self partially relates to integrative motivation or integrativeness, right? It doesn't always correlate exactly, but whenever you find one, you often will find the other. So if I have an ideal second language self, let's say where my target language or second language is Mandarin Chinese, or I'm going to use the idea of Japanese rather, because there's a lot of people out there who like anime and manga and whatever. So me, and that's the target language. Maybe I really am fascinated by Japanese culture, and I would love to move to Japan and live there for a while and interact with Japanese people and really kind of be in their world. And so often if that's a very intrinsic motivation for doing something, right? There's an interest in language and culture. Those are always very intrinsic. So that can, and so you can see how that's then related to the ideal self, because that's kind of who you want to be, a person who can interact with Japanese people and culture, but then also a desire to integrate into their world. So you can see why there'd be a correlation between Gardner's concept and Dornier's concept borrowed from Higgins. And then likewise with the Otu L2 self, this pretty much maps directly onto instrumental motivation, right? So that's really, you do something in order to satisfy a requirement or an expectation of someone else. And it aligns also with extrinsic motivations, to use self-determination theory terminology. Okay, so in the last kind of 5 and a bit minutes of this lecture, this was a study that I did. You can see the title there. This is from I think I gathered data in 2017, early in 2017, at 2 South African universities. And I've managed to get about 100 students who were learning isiXhosa as an additional language, either as their second or third or fourth, fifth language. I also actually got data from those who were first language Xhosa speakers or other Nguni speakers who were also in those classes. I just didn't analyze that data because it wasn't obviously relevant to my topic. And so, yeah, I was looking at their motivations, and I had, looked at Dornier's theory. I was interested in implementing it. And some of the findings, I'll look at the findings first, and then after that, I'll show you the research instrument that I used. And I want to do a bit of an activity where you would look through some of the questions I asked these students and identify which of them are relevant to the ideal second language self. Okay, so we're coming to that. There was a significant correlation I found, at least in this small sample size. I didn't look at all learners of Xhosa as an additional language. But the ideal second language self and integrative orientation for learning, I found, as previous literature has shown, that there was a correlation, that they kind of were linked. But then I also found that if I wanted to figure out, well, who was the most likely to persist or showed evidence of persistence in learning, that this ideal second language self, all the difference. So 20% of the sample, so only 1/5, had a positive score. So I obviously had to measure it somehow. I'll show you how I measured it next. But 20%, 1/5 of the entire class, which is not a lot, they actually could envision themselves, they could imagine themselves using the language in the future in various different ways. And that aligned, when I asked questions about if they intended to persist in learning, there was a correlation between a high or positive score for their ideal second language self and the intention to persist, or indeed the evidence of them already persisting. So if they were in second year, obviously that's evidence that they had persisted. But then as for that remaining 80%, they could not envision their future selves as users of Xhosa at all. And they had no intentions to persist in learning when I asked them that question. So 50%, they had an ambiguous, they couldn't agree that they actually could imagine themselves in the future using the language. They struggled to imagine their isiXhosa speaking ideal second language self. And then 30% had a negative score, as in they disagreed that they could see themselves using it in the future. Anyway, I thought I'd just like to give you a snapshot of some research that I did about how you would use the ideal second language self. And obviously, one of the ways that you can indirectly measure the intensity of motivation is whether people actually do persist, because that's a very easy thing to measure, that they persist. You can also ask them, and this is a self-report, so it's not as strong, will you persist in the future? They might actually just say yes on the questionnaire and then not do it in reality. But it's another way of getting a proxy or something that approximates persistence. So here's a bit of an activity just in the last 3 minutes. If you look at these questions, and I used what we call a Likert scale or Likert scale. So strongly disagree, disagree, slightly agree, agree, and strongly agree. And they had to select for each of these statements. So if you can identify which ones relate to the ideal self and the ought to self. I had to come up with all of these statements myself. And you can see I had a lot more. This is only the second page. I had 26 more of them on the previous page. Okay, so I'm going to just go through some of them, and maybe we can just, as a chorus, shout out whether you think it's either not relevant or ideal self or ought to self. All right, so not relevant, ideal self, or ought to self. Number 1.27. Do you think it's relevant, ideal self, or ought self? I think it is. Huh? Ought self. So we've got ought self. I would say that that has nothing to do with, yeah, this is more just a personality question, actually. I'm getting some personality data. What about the second one? I have daydreamed about being able to speak also fluently. Ought self. I think it's the ideal self. I mean, an interesting one about that, I'm not going to talk about it too long, but almost everyone I asked agreed with that, even those who showed no intention to persist. And so daydreaming, just thinking about it, isn't a very specific way of visualizing yourself in realistic circumstances using your second language, right? So what I realized, and it just in the last while, I won't actually ask you guys, but if you can imagine yourself giving a speech in your second language or target language successfully, that's a lot more specific. And pretty much only 20% of my sample agreed with that, right? So that's another one which is related to the ideal self. And I think those are actually the only two that are here. But if you looked at my future job to learn also, you might say that that relates to the ought self, right? Some of the others are completely unrelated to these two concepts. So anyway, before you go, so if you can just don't stand up too soon, there's a few things I want you to take note of. So firstly, the readings for Friday are now up on Are You Connected? There's one required reading, as I said, by Hummel. It's easy, and it looks at individual differences in general. Then there's a recommended reading. If your interest was piqued, if you're curious more about the second language motivational self-system, there's a really great reading that's optional. I will be taking you for lectures tomorrow and on Wednesday. And then on Wednesday, so very important, I highly recommend you come. We're going to be looking at the assignment for part of it, and also just some of the frequently asked questions about it. And then just a note, I'll be putting this at the end of each lecture slide, but please bring the updated assignment briefing. I've updated the assignment briefing. There's really just one part, it's highlighted in yellow. So if you download it again and look at it, it's highlighted in yellow. Please do read that. We will look at that both on Wednesday and on Friday. And then finally, if you are keen to make some progress now on your assignment, then look at the guides on Are You Connected for formulating interview questions and for transcribing your interview. They are both there. You'll find them on the Are You Connected page. That's all, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow for the dawning.
We have